Our next panel is the International River Panel, and we should get on it, right? Because we should build in more time for audience Q&A for back and forth participation. Yeah, we need to do a better job with that in the afternoon. So welcome back. Hope everyone enjoyed the lunch. This is our International River Panel, Mexico and the Colorado River System. We have three wonderful panelists to join us. Our main presenter will be Professor Carlos de la Parra from El Colegio de la Norte, or Frontera Norte. Carlos is also affiliated with Restauremos of Colorado. He will be joined by a colleague who's done a ton of Delta work, Osvel Hinojosa-Huerta, who works at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and also has done work for Pro Natura Noroeste. And they will be joined by Chris Harris, Executive Director of the Colorado River Board of California. Carlos will be speaking first. His presentation will consume most of the time. It will be followed by responses from Osvel and Chris. So without further ado, Carlos, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm really honored to be here. I thank you very much for the invitation. And so I wanted to give you a chance to think about international rivers and how they really are influential. About half of the surface in the earth is used up in international basins. And so this is one of them. And now that you've read that, I'm wondering how many of us would make those vows with just whomever happened to be next to you. Right? With no divorce clause included. But that's how we are dealing with an international river like the Colorado River. Oops. So I will try and give you historical context, not because I am a historian, but because I think it has bearing on the management of water. I will talk about the 1944 treaty briefly. In fact, I won't talk about it. I will just regurgitate shamelessly what Stephen Mummy says about the 1944 treaty, talk about U.S. Mexico relations. And you think about U.S. Mexico relations and how we have come this far, and we should really pat ourselves on the back because we are so different that it's a wonder that we have gotten this far. And then I want to characterize the agreement that we have and are building up on as an evolution of building mutual trust. You will hear tomorrow from former Commissioner Roberto Salmon, and I remember so many times that he said, this is all being built on trust, mutual trust between both countries, both delegations. And then, of course, as I said, there's no divorce clause in our agreement. And so the U.S. Mexico relation from this day forward, we need to talk about that. A little bit of historical context. As I said, it has bearing on management. And thinking about a couple of centuries ago, there was, at the start of the 20th century, a Mexican dictator who said it, and I'll say it in Spanish first, Pobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos. Poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States. But of course, there's the flip side of that. And the flip side of that is people within Mexico, and you know that Mexicans have a love-hate relationship with the US. And there are many Mexicans that will say, oh, we got to take advantage of this. Our location, our geopolitical location is so privileged. What would China do with 1 kilometer of border with the United States of America? And so we need to think about that also in the context of water and the asymmetries between US and Mexico, because they do have a bearing on how we're managing water. But of course, in 1846 and 1848, there was a US Mexican war. And that has probably created the greatest scars within cultural analysis of many stakeholders within Mexico. How long is it going to take to heal? The dictator said it first, and then in 1937, the contrary of the political spectrum, the most progressive president probably ever in history in Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, who did the Agrarian Reform and did so many institutions in Mexico. He did what is called el asalto a las tierras, the assault on the land. The Colorado River Land Company was the owner of a lot of property in Mexicali, and el asalto a las tierras is celebrated on the January 27th in Mexicali because we were liberated from the Yankee imperialism and the dominion that it held in the waters of the Colorado River. Stephen Mummy says the 1944 treaty is a constitutional treaty because it is complex, and it means that several layers of government are included there. There's also the issue of three rivers and how the exchanges in water balance out, even though there's no accounting between the Colorado River and the Rio Bravo, Rio Grande. Its water allocation function by the fact that it established an implementation agency, the International Boundary and Water Commission, of course, allowance for interpretation and amendments through minutes. The provisions for fact-finding and dispute resolution are included. The longevity, and now, you know, we're getting very close to 80 years. The treaty of 80 years is pretty long-standing. The general acceptance by stakeholders in both countries. So the treaty is solid. It actually, once the scars of the war started healing, it actually created the basis for Mexico to begin developing the northern border. It didn't have any legal security over water until that happened. But we have to acknowledge something about what we have in terms of the context. Mexico and the US are, in the stakeholders I've noted there, are probably the most important stakeholders regarding water management in the Colorado River: government, agriculture, and the environmental community of late. But these are parallel universes. In Mexico, water is the property of the nation. It's a centralized government. It's run in Mexico City. What Mexicali says is only a proposal that needs to be ratified by Mexico City, which is 3,000 kilometers away from Mexicali. In the US, the discussion in government is a collegial discussion. It's really the dictate of many of the states mostly, and so they're not equal. In fact, when Mexico and the US began talking about Minute 319, it dawned on Mexicans that we weren't talking to the United States. We were talking to 7 different parties. And so in agriculture, for instance, also, for Mexico, it was the Agrarian Reform of the revolution. And, you know, you start asking the question about why was Mexico excluded from the 1922 compact. Mexico was in the midst of a revolution. And so the All-American Canal is also the outgrowth of instability in institutions. And so the Agrarian Reform was the means for political control. You gave land to the peasants, and you didn't give them the land as a title, as a property. You gave them the land, but it belongs to the federal government, and you work on the land for political control. Whereas in the US, ag is an industry, and water markets are, you know, the prime, the staple for agriculture. And then the newcomer of the environmental advocacy groups in the U.S. and in all industrial nations, this is the product of domestic resource management. It is an issue of political institutions, of philanthropy, whereas in developing countries, and I got this the other way around. Sorry for that, but in the U.S., the global in origin and lobby to government, it's the other way around. That's how it happens in developing countries. Environmentalism was first created as a global concept before developing nations got around to thinking about it and actually starting to act upon it. And so I want to take a little more time here to talk about the evolution of building trust, because in the 1944 treaty, you will read a lot of controversy about the allocation for Mexico. Why did Mexico get 10% of the river? It's only got less than 1% of the land, 644,000 square kilometers. Somebody do the math and tell me what that's in square miles, but it's the largest cross-border watershed between US and Mexico. Why did Mexico get 10%? There are a lot of answers, according to historians. One of them is the Second World War and the good neighbor policy and the fact that Mexican oil should not fall into the hands of the Axis in Germany. And so FDR really thought that it needed to have Mexico on its side. Did that create any dents on the US side? Of course it did. But Mexico got 10% of the allocation. If there's any Mexican that raises his hand in Mexico and says we should renegotiate the treaty, that Mexican is no longer a Mexican. So please write their name and we'll deal with that. From 1944 to 1961, I think both countries were starting to learn about how to deal with the treaty. And so the first years were, the 1956 Colorado River Basin Storage Project, and then the Basin Project Act and so forth. And so the United States started using the treaty and using the compact to begin to develop. For Mexico, it was quite different because of the distance, because of the centralization and so forth. So from 1944 to 1961, let's just say it was the first years and it wasn't equal. But then the salinity crisis hit. And so the effects of those first years begin, and there were about 12 years between the time that Mexico said, spike in salinity from 800 ppm to 3,000 and 4,000 and 5,000 ppm until 1973, when Minute 242 got around to solving the definitive problem, or something like that is how it's phrased. But then came the years of surplus. And so that's when a lot of folks that are in the room here and of the NGO variety started getting some ideas like Osvel Hinojosa, just add water. And suddenly the ecosystem started becoming green. And so a lot of activity that is ongoing right now started in those years of surplus. But then the year 2000 came around and the looming shortage. And so suddenly we were moving from surplus to shortage. And at the end of 2000, of that stage, we hit upon the All-American Canal, the lining of the All-American Canal. And, for all of the disparities, the asymmetries, the differences between US and Mexico, over 120, 130, even more years, I think we're going on more than 150 years of sharing waters. There's only been one dispute not resolved, the All-American Canal. So that's quite amazing. I mean, I really think that it's a tribute to the diplomats that have worked on this, the institutional framework, including the International Boundary and Water Commission. And so after the All-American Canal issue, we had bottom. It's the only dispute that we haven't resolved. And out of that came that period, which I call growing close, from 2010 to 2020. Pun intended, it was a partnership defined in 5 minutes. Here are the parallel universes over the course of these years. You know, in 2005 and 2007, the All-American Canal, and I've asked this to many people, was it an anathema or a blessing? And, you know, you get like equal responses from both sides. If it hadn't been for the All-American Canal, we'd be so much further along. Others say, no, it was the issue that sparked the collaboration that we're seeing right now. But the role of water markets and these discrepancies in how the agricultural sector works on both sides of the border is actually, in my mind, the underpinnings of what happened with the All-American Canal lining, because the United States was already lining agricultural canals to move water to other purposes. Mexico didn't have a clue about what that was about. We, in fact, if you read carefully about the All-American Canal, it wasn't a dispute about water. Mexico presented a complaint regarding the environmental impact of the All-American Canal and the fact that seepage was not going to continue to water the Mesa Andrade wetlands. And the first article I read about the Andrade Mesa wetlands was written by this guy, Osvel Hinojosa. I remember that because I was in the Mexican embassy at the time. And so that was the only thing we had, because water flowing in land in the United States with water from the United States seeping into the ground of the United States being disputed by Mexico, really? And so it was the environmental impact. But then in 2007, there came Dirk Kempthorne and Arturo Sarucán, and they signed this joint agreement, a letter. And if you look at the Secretary of the Interior meeting with not his counterpart, but the ambassador, and signing a letter that they agreed to, this is totally outside the protocol. And I have approached Arturo Sarucán, who was then ambassador to Mexico, and yes, he said it was outside the protocol, and that's why we were able to do it. So you got to think outside the box and act outside the box for the challenges that are coming. But then, of course, parallel to that, the shortage guidelines were taking place, and Mexico was not privy to what was happening and was only invited when the cake was already baked. And so, again, coming so far as we have is really a tribute to the diplomacy of both countries. I would say that as we started in meeting in 5 minutes, from minute 316, 317, 318, and then minute 319, and then minute 323, there was this evolution, the growing sense that we needed to build trust with each other. And many in this room sat through very lengthy conversations. I mean, it took 5 years to deal with minute 319. But I have a question for all that were there. And maybe Roberto Salmon can talk about this tomorrow, but what would have happened if there hadn't been an earthquake on the 4th of April of 2010? And the issue is that with this resentment, historical resentment in many Mexican enclaves, the fact that the Mexican commissioner needed to go to Mexican Congress and say, we're working on a deal with the United States. The deal is that we could store water, Mexican water, in the US, was a non-starter, politically speaking, unless the commissioner was able to go to the president of Mexico and say, there's been an earthquake, we can't use the water. And so we need to sign an agreement, and the agreement would allow us to begin storing water in Lake Mead. It was a completely different. It was a heaven-sent earthquake, and if you don't believe it, read what Deepak Chopra said about the earthquake. If anyone has read his Twitter, Deepak Chopra, April 4th, 2010, then write to me about it. Against all odds, minute 319 was signed, and then in minute 323, it was gaining momentum. Very simple story, right? That's it. That's a diagram, courtesy of Roberto Salmon. But you see that basin conditions are in the top line. That's how they were evolving. And then the conflict of the All-American Canal and how there was a breach in binational conversation and the lining was completed. Then cooperation began. And all of them just kind of overlapping with each other. And of course, right at the right-hand corner at the bottom, agriculture was aloof, completely absent of all discussion. For Mexico, the Colorado River, since the 1944 treaty, was just that, a reliable faucet that would deliver 1.5 million acre feet. And suddenly the United States of America and the 7 basin states were asking Mexico to sit down and talk about how to fix a reliable faucet that was delivering 1.5 million acre feet. And Mexico thought, why should I get involved with this? And of course, climate change was the first reason, but that wasn't so apparent then. So this guy is saying, okay. Very soon, Mexico discovered it wasn't that simple. It wasn't a faucet. It was very complex. It's the law of the river and the infrastructure and water markets and so on and so forth. But at the outset, what happened was that Mexico changed from being an afterthought to a bona fide partner in the Colorado River. And that is a hell of a lot different when we start talking in 1922 about what's going to happen in 1926. Or, excuse me, I'm a century off. When we're talking in 2022 about 2026. How do we get here? And this is almost my last slide. Why was there a sea change in policy? So just thinking analytically about this, there were a couple of crises that overlapped. There was an environmental crisis, the hot drought, and the hot drought is a term coined, I think, by Udall and Overpeck. And it really saved negotiations when you start looking at precipitation and was there really a drought in the US? And the answer is not a precipitation, it's a hot drought. It's decoupling precipitation with surface flow. But an environmental crisis combined with a diplomatic crisis, the All-American Canal, made both countries sit down and really begin to talk. The second is that the framework was evidently exhausted. There was a need to begin to rethink this, and like the variations in water quality and water deliveries for Mexico that has really shaken up the Mexicali Valley, the salinity crisis being just the most outstanding example. A revamping of infrastructure and the outlook on water in Mexico is also another feature of that inadequate framework. Third, it's the formalization of a new governance. We are now talking about a whole different ballgame regarding how 2 federal governments talk about this international river. At the end of the day, that governance was a merging of advocacy and diplomacy. In policy circles, it's called advocacy coalition, but the NGOs were really at the front end of doing stuff like the Conservation Before Shortage Initiative, the transfer of knowledge from cross-border, doing citizens shuttling diplomacy from one side of the border to the other, and of course, applying science. The whole NGO game in the Colorado River changed from being advocacy to policy analysis to diplomacy. This is an example of how both countries, from government sector and from the NGO sector, created the basis for changing. Final thoughts. I think there were 3 transcendent transformations that need to be honored since minute 319. First of all, the pulse flow. It's been mentioned before. and Castle mentioned, the pulse flow. And you should know, though, that in history, there has never been another agreement, cross-border agreement, that dedicates water for ecosystem restoration. There have been many agreements that deal with economic, that deal with dividing the waters, that deal with industrial developments, or even pollution control, but not for ecosystem restoration. Is this a model for the future in the age of climate change? I think so. Secondly, the participatory diplomacy, which has been an area of study. The non-government diplomacy book by a French author is quoted there. Not parallel diplomacy, but participatory. It's a part of the diplomacy that wasn't there 20 years ago. Lastly, if you look at what's happened, U.S. and Mexico have actually taken a step further. It's not about bilateral water agreements. It's about a regional water. It's made the Colorado River on both sides of the border our river. And that's different. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you, Carlos. That was great. So I want to do some remarks and complement the information that Carlos has provided. That was an amazing background. And probably first you'll be wondering why the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, right? The delta of the Colorado River, even in its current state, is one of the most important places in the continent for migratory birds. So now we know that there are between 14 and 17 million migratory birds that go through the delta every year. So just try to picture that amount. So the delta provides environmental services well beyond the region. Also, these are birds that go back and forth between the Arctic and all the way down to South America. So it's one of the really cool things about this place, that despite all of the changes that have been going on, it's still very resilient, and it's one of the most important wetlands worldwide. And I want to mention also something really critical that Carlos mentioned a little bit about is the importance of the compact and the treaty for Mexico. Many times in Mexico you hear the narrative about the disparity and what Carlos was mentioning about the baggage, and the concerns about what the U.S. is doing to Mexico. But in reality, the growth and the development, especially in Baja California, but also in northwestern Sonora, it's supported by the compact, the treaty, and the infrastructure in the Colorado River Basin. So that's, for me, it's something really important to nail down, especially in the narratives in Mexico. Of course, that there have been trade-offs. We know about the decline in the Colorado River Delta, and also the cultural and tribal impacts. We have been hearing about the impacts on tribal nations in the U.S., and this has happened in Mexico with the Cocopah. Also, there's still important communities of the Cocopah in the Colorado River Delta. They still rely on fishing. So that's a very important component to keep in mind. But from all that, there's been this evolution that we have been seeing. I think it's been critical that aspect of understanding the other, and building, in addition to building trust, building empathy. That the basis for this progress is really empathy towards the system, towards the basin, learning the system, but also learning the needs of all of the different partners, learning the perspectives, but also the cultural values. What makes us come to the table, and what is it that we're looking for. And I think another important component to keep in mind is in the narratives, we tend to simplify things. So in Mexico, it's been really common to say, the U.S., as if the U.S. was a single unit, But of course, we know that every state has its own agenda, and then within the state, there are municipal water interests, and then there are tribal nations. So it's not one unit, right? It's many different entities that we are discussing. So in Mexico, it's the same. So you're not negotiating with Mexico. Of course, there is a voice, no, and an entity, IBWC, U.S. Mexican sections, but there are many entities within Mexico, the federal government, and then the states, Baja California and Sonora, and then the irrigation district, and then the water users. There are about 16,000 individual agricultural water users in the Mexicali Valley, no? And everyone has their own perspective about it. And then, of course, the environment, and again, the Kukapa, no? And I guess in this evolution, there's been this, very optimistic results. It's these great advances. And for me, one of them is having a seat at the table, no? Before minute 319, it was impossible just to think for NGOs, but also for stakeholders other than the federal governments to be seated at the table. So I think that's a great result of the process. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have been seeing these results. And I think it's also really important to recognize that Mexico has been building the capacity, and I think there is the willingness to participate in adaptation, in mitigation against climate change and the drought, and not only the local level, but at the basin level. And also, I think we need to capitalize more on the border culture. No, in the border region, things are very fluid. No, there is not U.S. and Mexico. Really, there are a lot of integration, especially in the private sector, but in the communities. And I don't think we have used that to our advantage in the binational negotiations. I think we should do that more often. And then just finally, this idea that, of course, we are trying to figure out and solve the Colorado River Basin for our constituencies, right? And for our challenges, but it's probably this is one of the most difficult challenges worldwide in terms of water and allocation of resources. But I think that, we're paving the way for this new relationship between humanity and nature, especially now in terms in the face of climate change. Thank you.
It's a tough act following these two. Carlos, I really want to thank you for the story that you told. I think it's a tremendously accurate depiction of the complicated relationship between our two countries and the challenges that we have faced binationally over time since the treaty was implemented. And I really agree with you completely, you and Osvel both, on the evolution and particularly the dynamics, how they've improved so much since 2000 and particularly since the earthquake in 2010. And I just wanted to share with all of you and my colleagues here my own personal perspectives, given my history in Colorado River issues. And I can remember the first time I went down to Mexico and saw the Upper Gulf, the Ciénaga de Santa Clara, in like 1993, 94. And I was working for the state of Arizona at the time, and I knew nothing about it. I knew about the literal interpretation and administration of the 1944 treaty and Minute 242, and that's about as far as it went. And going down there and seeing the landscape of the Delta region from the Limotroph Division all the way down to the Sea of Cortez was an eye-opener for me. It really was. And I think you guys both have hit on a key theme here, is that in many of our relationships worldwide, the environment is always the last afterthought that drives significant policy change. And maybe one could say that also occurred here. But I think both of these guys have hit on something that really, it was the focus on the environment. And I would go back to John Bernal at the U.S. IBWC, and I believe Arturo Herrera as SELA commissioner in 1999-2000 with Minute 306, which was the conceptual framework to do potentially good things for the Delta region. That was kind of a game changer for all of us, because to that point in time, there had been the administrative relationship between the two countries. We reported out each year, here's how much water we delivered. Here was the water quality under minute 242, so on and so forth. You couldn't really pop the hood and get in there and fine tune things and make the machine run better or be more nimble or faster. So I think it really was starting about then, 2000, that we started to look at this binational relationship between our two countries and genuinely start making some changes. It's incredibly dynamic, it's difficult, it's complex, and it's challenging, and we're nowhere near done. We've got huge challenges facing us going forward. There was no path forward for participation of either the two Mexican states, Baja California and Sonora, or the 7 basin states at that point in time. It was still largely federally driven processes in both countries. Jose Campoy and the Biosphere Reserve, you know, seeing that place and understanding both the ecological value of the Cienega and the Upper Gulf, as well as the cultural value to the ejidos down there, and that there was a potential ecotourism market, and that the Cucapao tribe, all of them were connected to both the river, the Rio Hardy and the Rio Colorado, as well as the Upper Gulf, was, again, that was good for the United States and the states to understand. The 2010 earthquake, boy, your encapsulation of how that process went. That earthquake happened, and as tragic as it was, and we're still dealing with the after effects of that in the Mexicali Valley and to some degree the Imperial Valley, but it was a game changer. And I know Roberto Salmon, former Commissioner Salmon, is here, and he and his staff at CELA, that's leadership, folks. And that's leadership in 5 minutes, like you said. It was nimble and it was fast. And look at where we are now. We are at a place where Mexico is implementing water conservation. They're storing water in a large U.S. reservoir because they have no capacity for storage in Mexico. It gives them management flexibility, operational flexibility, and it gives them the ability to participate in taking demonstrably positive actions for the Colorado River Basin. That's what buys you full partnership in a process going forward. That was huge. And almost immediately after 317, 318, we got that big comprehensive minute with minute 319. And that took us then to minute 323, where now Mexico even took the lead and said, we know you guys are having these drought contingency plan discussions in the United States. We think that's a good idea. We'd like to kick in a little bit through our binational water scarcity contingency plan. And we'll even execute that agreement now, knowing you guys aren't quite ready yet with the DCP process and in the domestic agreements in the United States. They were a year and a half, almost 2 years ahead of us. That was huge. And that's where I have this cautious optimism going forward that this binational relationship that we have right now can actually help inform all of us domestically in the United States that we've got to adopt the same innovative, outside the box thinking as we deal with the challenges of climate change and meeting, you know, the complexity of dealing with the supply and demand imbalance that all of us face going forward. And whether you're trying to do good things for the environment or ensure that local economies can be maintained, whether it's in the United States or in Mexico, this is now, I believe, we all need to say, a full-blown partnership. And we've got to go forward under that rubric, so to speak. I think some of the challenges we have in the 21st century, and, you know, I'm part of the Minute Oversight Group for Minute 323 with my colleague Tom Bishotsky in Arizona and Greg Walsh in Nevada, and our federal partners, and then our Mexican partners at the NGO level, the state and federal level. And there is a deep and abiding understanding and concern associated with the drought and the challenges that we face with climate change, water quality impacts, we're going to have to look at how best to manage salinity, both in the saline drainage that we convey into Mexico and what are the impacts to the Cienega, as well as the upper Gulf. Water conservation and augmentation. Are there things that the two countries can collectively do that can benefit both nations? Environmental habitat restoration and species management. As you said, this is a critical piece of the Pacific Flyway. The upper Gulf is connected to the Salton Sea, is connected to the rest of the Pacific coast, is connected to the Rocky Mountain Flyway, all of these things. It's a integrated system, and we can't ignore one piece at the peril of it all. The other thing I think that's been very deftly done by both countries is that treaty, as Carlos mentioned, covers 3 rivers broadly and some minor tributaries too. But we have managed to keep a very bright line between the politics of managing the Rio Colorado and, for example, the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande. And I think we've got to keep doing that. The Rio Grande has issues that are very important, not taken away from that, but those issues need to be solved in their appropriate forms. We can't blend the complexities and the challenges of both. But anyway, as I said, with the staff at SELA and the NGO colleagues that we work with, I think we're in good hands. We've got a good roadmap going forward. And I am optimistic that we will enhance the binational relationship between the two countries. Like I said, there's still work to be done. But I think we're up for working together as we put together the post-2026 framework between the United States and Mexico. And I think I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks so much to all the panelists. Wonderful to have U.S. and Mexican perspective. Most of the questions coming in the queue have to do with the Delta and environmental issues. Please keep sending them in to Slido. I'll read off one. I'll let the panelists decide who would like to speak on it. What was learned from the 2014 pulse flow? Will there be other pulse flows planned under minute 323? I can exercise moderator's prerogative. On the latter part, how is minute 323 different in terms of its approach to environmental flows than minute 319? So first part, what was learned from the pulse flow under minute 319? How's minute 323 different in terms of its approach to environmental flows? Any takers? Osvel.
Yeah, sure. And please, Carlos and Chris, if you want to add anything. So yeah, with the pulse flow of 2014, we learned a lot. It's one of the, the great ideas in minute 319 was to, of course, have this amazing release of water, but then have the funding and the institutional arrangements for the science part. Also, to make sure that there are teams from both countries of scientists going out to measure the hydrological and ecological response. I think that was brilliant. And we learned a lot about the hydrology, how the water moves, the infiltration rates, how far the water goes, but then also the response of the vegetation and the response of wildlife, in particular birds. One of the things that we learned is that there was a lot of water going into infiltration. And of course, aquifer recharge is important. It's a benefit. It was not optimal in terms of the ecological response. So based on that knowledge and that learning, we were able to design the flow releases under minute 323 differently, so that instead of doing a big release from Morelos Dam all the way down, there was a lot of work with the operators of the irrigation district, the farmers, to use the infrastructure of the Mexicali Valley to convey water into the priority restoration sites in the Delta. So we were bypassing the driest reaches of the Colorado River in Mexico that are dry, and groundwater is very, very deep. It's 50, 60 feet deep. So we were bypassing that thanks to the support of the Mexicali Irrigation District and sending the water more directly into the restoration sites, and then also allowing for longer periods of time with water, and also allowing for a better connection between the river and the estuary, And we're seeing amazing results. And also We have been learning that, of course, in the places where there is active management in terms of restoration, we see the fastest and the most lasting results in terms of wildlife response.
Carlos, Chris, anything to add to that?
I would just say that we learned the same thing in the context of the Lower Colorado River Multi-Species Conservation Program. We also could not achieve, overbank flooding to naturally reestablish native riparian habitats below Hoover Dam down to the Mexican border. So we've also utilized existing irrigation water delivery infrastructure, and it's worked remarkably well. We have large patches now of cottonwood willow habitat, just as Osvel and the folks down there have done at Laguna Grande and other areas. It's with a limited resource, water resource, you've really got to be selective about how you target your habitats and so forth. But that's adaptive management. And I think we're going to have to do more and more of that as we go forward.
Okay. Carlos?
Just very quickly, nothing to do with science, but to do with hard science, but just the cultural aspect, how people in the Mexicali Valley rediscovered the Colorado River. Grandparents living in Yuma, Arizona, taking their kids to San Luis Rio Colorado to have them bathe as they did 50 years ago. That was really awesome, an awesome spectacle. Secondly, the trust, the confidence that government agencies placed on the design by the environmental work group composed of NGOs. I really tip my hat to government agencies like the Bureau of Reclamation, the International Boundary and Water Commission on the U.S. side, the states on the U.S. side, on the Mexican side, la Comisión Internacional de Límites y Aguas, la Comisión Nacional del Agua, because it was a lot of water. It was a lot of water, and it was granted right from the beginning. It was something that we needed to do to begin to know the ecosystem. And government agencies don't do things like that readily. And so I really want to just express the appreciation for the government hosting of this landmark event.
Much appreciated. I think we have time for one more question. It's a binational infrastructure question. So again, whoever wishes to take it, I'll just read it from the queue. What does the current state of U.S. Mexico relations on the river say about the potential for construction of a proposed sea-to-sea canal from the Sea of Cortez to the Salton Sea to address water level declines from the quantification settlement agreement? Sea-to-sea canal question. Chris.
I know the state of California, they put out a request for proposal process, and I believe there have been a number of proposals that were submitted in the context of the existing Salton Sea Management Program that's being administered through the California Natural Resources Agency. And they're evaluating those proposals. I assume that at some point they'll make a determination in conjunction with the stakeholder communities if one or more of those make sense, if there are attributes in there that can be utilized. I think there are other infrastructure opportunities, though, between the two countries that need to be explored, whether it's potentially down the road. These are, again, sort of long-term projects, but looking at desalination plants on either the Sea of Cortez side or the Pacific side in Baja California. And then looking at innovative binational exchanges between the two countries. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. You'd have probably subsequent minutes under the treaty. But I do believe there are additional infrastructure opportunities. A lot of them are being done now under the framework of the 319 minute and now 323 with system efficiency improvement projects in the Mexicali Valley. I think that effort will continue, may get ramped up over time as well. So I think there are definitely a range of opportunities available.
Mexican perspective on infrastructure, sea-to-sea canal or otherwise.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Thank you for the comments, Chris. I think that an essential part is that we need to be creative. So I think we should explore all of the different options we should not negate or the possibility to any potential solution. But I think we have learned a lot on how to make them successful. No? So I think they need to be the science need to be very sound. There's need to be transparency. There's need to be broad participation of all stakeholders. It needs to take the time to build the trust and make it as wide in terms of benefits as possible. No, so how does this solution benefits, of course, Salton Sea, but other partners in the basin and other Mexican constituents also. No, so I think that's the key. No, so I think it has its merits and it needs to be evaluated in this context. And I agree, we should explore all of the different options in the same context. No, desal, water conservation, and other infrastructures.
Carlos, you wish to add anything?
Just thank you for your shepherding of this panel, your orientation and your encouragement to keep working at it. And I really appreciate it. I really enjoy being here. Thank you very much. Nothing about
this. Around and thank them again. So next panel is a big one. Science and governance, from over-allocation to climate change and megadrought. That starts at 3 o'clock. That will be moderated by none other than John Fleck. Please be back on time and we can keep the audience participation piece going. All right, have a good break.